Okay, video number 2. If you watched the first one, you should now know 3 good reasons to take Aristophanes seriously as a blueprint for empowering the disempowered. In this video, though, I'm going to pop that bubble and argue from the counter position that maybe Aristophanes' comedy is actually making fun of or is just a big joke about what it would mean to live in a society where the least empowered are now in charge. Okay, gonna share my screen just like last time, but now I've figured out how to make my head really big, which I'm super excited about. Okay, a really optimistic reading of Aristophanes' Lysistrata might suggest that we have a template from the ancient world for turning society topsy-turvy. But there's a couple of, I think, important pieces of evidence we have to keep in mind, especially about the interpretation and audience of this play that might make us think differently and think that all of this is just a thought experiment ad absurdum, meaning just for a laugh, right? Just for comedic effect. As I said really quick, this image at the beginning, this first slide, Lysistrata is reperformed very often with all-female casts, but as we're going to see in a minute, that's not the way it would have been done in the ancient world. Okay, first reason why I think maybe Aristophanes is writing Lysistrata for a laugh. Let me put myself down here. So democracy in the Greek world is not only the first of its kind, but it is remarkably inclusive. In ancient Athens, there were not any property or education requirements. Once you became an adult male around the age of 30, you had an equal say and an equal vote in Athens. But even though this is a really inclusive democracy for the ancient world, there's a lot of ways in which it's still pretty exclusive. So women were never included in the political process of ancient Athens. It didn't matter how high class you were, if you could read or not. Women did not come to the assembly. They did not give speeches. In many ways, they were not even supposed to be heard outside the confines of their own home or domestic family unit. This also is true for slaves, of which there were a tremendous number in ancient Athens, some of them Greek, some of them imported. I think this illustration shows us a dark-skinned slave. We can see him kind of right over here in the left-hand corner, perhaps imported from Phoenicia, modern-day Syria, or North Africa, but also slaves came from the Black Sea region too. Lots of slaves in Athens, no vote, no participation. And finally, of course, immigrants. Athens was an economic hub, had a huge number of immigrants, but did not have a say, could not own property, could not pass laws or participate in government. So if you remember that quote from my last slide in which Lysistrata is saying, a good democracy might have to weave or integrate these people in, it's not clear how far she's going in saying that, but she is certainly aware of a huge number of disempowered people in Athens. So let's not get our thought experiment too big. We're still living in a city-state that contains political power to the hands of a few adult male citizens. Okay, second reason why we might want to be a little more critical of Aristophanes' intentions. Last lecture, I showed you some examples of other classical Athenian thought leaders who are experimenting with the idea of women in philosophy, right, or women as political advisors. But for all those texts, there's also plenty of other ones that show us perhaps what mainstream Greek men thought about women interfering in politics. One very famous model is, of course, in Homer's Iliad. This is the passage on the left. And this is a scene from book 1 in which the queen of the gods, Hera, the wife of Zeus, has been interfering in his plans for the Trojan War. And what we see is that Zeus just shuts her down, specifically with a threat of violence. He says, "Hera," replied the father of men and gods, "do not expect to know all my thoughts. Though you are my wife, you would find it a burden. Now sit there quiet and obey me, or else I will set my all-powerful hands on you, and all the gods of Olympus lack the strength to save you." This is such a disquieting passage because Hera is not just your everyday gal. She is queen of the gods, right? Wife consort of the king of the gods. But here, what we see is Zeus talks down to her and says that trying to take on big political plans would be a burden for her and threatens her with physical force if she disobeys him. We see a similar threat in this passage on the right. This is from a poet named Simonides, whom we encountered again. Do you remember him? He was a character in Xenophon's Hero. And he writes a pretty misogynistic but famous poem, poem number 7, in which he goes through and he compares women to different types of animals, like what kind of wife or girlfriend would be the best and worst kind to have. And one of the worst he talks about is the dog woman, who, I quote here, is a no good bitch, a mother through and through. She wants to hear everything, know everything, go everywhere. A man can't stop her barking, not with threats and not by knocking out her teeth with a stone, and not with sweet talk either. This is a pretty horrifying poem for most of us modern readers, but it gives you a sense that a woman who had too much to say or wanted to participate or had big ideas beyond her station, there's plenty of Greek literature to support the idea that shutting her down is the right, even noble thing for a husband to do. So Lysistrata, it might be a grand thought experiment, but Aristophanes probably knows that most of the people in his audience tend to think about women in power in these terms and not in the terms that he's suggesting in his play. Another element that I want to think about here, and I think this is sort of my third and closing one, is the context of ancient comedy. When we watch reproductions of Lysistrata today, we tend to see a lot of women actors, right? Actresses playing Lysistrata or playing Stratonike, right? Some of the other female characters. But in ancient tragedy and comedy, all roles were played by men. This is also true, I think, in Shakespearean England, right? Even the beautiful female characters are played by men. And in comedy, that means wearing a big, ugly mask and a sort of big, ugly suit with a little bit of a fat pouch in front, even if you're covered by a dress. And so it's a little bit of a mind bender to imagine yourself in the audience watching the character Lysistrata talking about how grand women are, when you know darn well that the person under that costume is actually a male actor. And it might make the effect really different, like really funny or really ironic, as opposed to something we could take seriously. We also are pretty sure from our evidence that women were not even allowed to watch comedies, right? It was thought to be too inappropriate, too salacious for female audiences. So think about the effect of an all-male audience watching an all-male cast performing these female roles. And what we could get rather is something more akin to stereotyping or satire of what a whiny woman sounds like. It could be a little bit, I want to be careful here with my comparison, not exactly like, but perhaps somewhat analogous to what I think of as the imitation ad absurdum of blackface minstrelsy, right, in the American theatrical tradition. Right, this is when we have white stage actors wearing blackface to perform as stereotyped African American identities. And I don't think that any of us watching these shows would think, oh, like this is a real attempt to promote or understand African Americans or their culture. No, what's really going on is that the stereotype and the associations with African American culture in these shows is being used as a source of comedy, right? It's not really an attempt to understand. It's an attempt to imitate ad absurdum, right? To imitate for the point of producing a ridiculous effect. And I think it's possible, one possible interpretation, that maybe we have a somewhat similar effect for Lysistrata. We might get a sense of that, and this is what I want to close on, that the point is sort of humor and mockery of women rather than empowerment of women, by looking at the way in which this play sometimes reinforces negative stereotypes of women, as opposed to the grand power vision that Lysistrata has. In this scene, the character Stratilis is threatening the male magistrate, but in a weird way, by saying, you got to do the right thing so that I can go home, which is where I want to be. She says, if you resort to wanton violence, you can't complain if you get hit right back. We, i.e., we women, only want to stay demure at home, doing no harm, disturbing not a twig. But he who would provoke me should remember that those who rifle wasps' nest stings, sorry, I messed that up. Wasps' nests will be stung, right? So Stratilis here is saying we're only participating in the political process because of the way that men have failed us. But our true desire as women is to stay at home. This is not really an empowering message, and it doesn't quite align with what Lysistrata has to say. So even within this play, we have counterpoints of female perspectives about what is and isn't the right path for female participation. We get another sense of this, and this is my very last slide, when the magistrate says that actually men might be to blame for all of women's bad habits. In this passage, he sort of puns or spoofs on the stereotype that ancient Greek women like to have a lot of adulterous affairs. So he goes on to talk about, with all this sort of sexual humor, about women cheating on their husbands with various different craftsmen, right? Goldsmith, that necklace you mended for my wife, she was dancing last night and the pin slipped out of the hole. Ha ha ha. Or shoemaker, the strap on my wife's sandal is hurting her little pinky. It's rather tender. Could you go around about lunchtime and loosen her up? Again, sorry, really gross sexual humor here. Although, I don't know, I mean, sexual humor has cracked people up throughout the ages. But the stereotype that's being conveyed by this play is that women can't be trusted, that they cheat, they fool around on their men, and that men are just as much to blame for corrupting women as women are. Not a particularly empowering portrait of the fair sex in ancient Athens. Okay, I'm going to wrap myself up here and say to you that I hope these two videos have now given you a little bit to think with. And also, as you go to watch Spike Lee's adaptation, Chirac, of this exact play, to have similar questions in mind about the extent to which comedic artistic betrayals can really offer a serious social critique of leadership and those who are disempowered from the leadership enterprise. Okay, I look forward to seeing you guys hopefully in Zoom in-person-ish form on Wednesday. Adios.